German Shepherd dog raised abandoned lion cubs, but 2 years later, something shocking happened. Amidst the golden grasses of the White Lion Reserve, dawn painted the sky in hues of amber and rose. The land, usually tranquil, was tense with uncertainty. Deep within the main enclosure, Sirona, the reserve's only lioness, lay exhausted in the shade of a thorn tree. Her breathing was shallow, flanks heaving, eyes half-lidded with fatigue. Nearby, two newborn cubs, a male and a female, whimpered weakly, pressing against the cold earth in search of warmth and milk. But Sirona turned away, her gaze distant and unseeing. It had been 4 days since she gave birth, yet she had not once nudged them close or offered them nourishment. The reserve staff watched helplessly from behind the fences, their faces etched with worry. Sirona's rejection was not an act of cruelty, but a tragedy of instinct denied. Rescued months ago, she had survived alone in the wild, battling sickness and starvation. Whatever spark of maternal instinct she might have possessed seemed smothered by trauma and distrust. Her golden eyes, once fierce, were now dulled with a wariness that broke the hearts of those who had worked tirelessly to save her life. In the control room, Anna, the head veterinarian, ran a tired hand through her dark curls, eyes fixed on the monitor displaying the scene. "We can't wait any longer," she said, her voice low but firm. "They've lost too much weight already. If we don't intervene today, they won't make it." Her assistant Marcus nodded grimly, already gathering supplies. The decision was swift and certain. Within the hour, they tranquilized Sirona just enough to ease her into sleep without distressing the cubs. Two handlers moved quickly, lifting the fragile bundles with gloved hands and wrapping them in warm blankets. The cubs were alarmingly light, rib bones stark beneath thin fur, their cries faint and exhausted. "Come on, little ones," Anna murmured, cradling the female cub closer to her chest, feeling the weak flutter of its heartbeat. "Hold on." They hurried to the reserve's clinic, a modest building at the edge of the property, where incubators and milk formula awaited. Anna worked quickly, feeding the cubs through tiny bottles, her hands steady but her eyes glistening with unshed tears. By the end of the day, both cubs had managed to swallow enough to survive the night, but their chances were still precarious at best. Their eyes remained closed, their movements slow and uncoordinated, as if unsure whether to fight or surrender. For the next week, the staff lived in shifts, sleeping on cots in the clinic and waking every 2 hours to feed the cubs. It was grueling, but each tiny improvement, a stronger cry, a twitch of ears, a small stretch of limbs, felt like a victory worth the exhaustion. Yet as days passed, one fact became increasingly clear. The milk formula alone would not suffice. The cubs needed a mother, not just for nourishment, but for warmth, grooming, and the tactile comfort essential for survival. Anna's worry deepened with each passing day. That's when the call came. It was a neighbor from the town nearby, an elderly woman named Clara, who volunteered at the reserve from time to time. Her voice crackled over the radio. "My Sandra's just weaned her pups," she said, words slow and careful. "She has plenty of milk left. Maybe, well, I know it sounds strange, but would you consider—" Anna hesitated, fingers tight around the radio. A German Shepherd nursing lion cubs was unprecedented, risky even, but the clock was ticking, and the cubs were slipping away despite their best efforts. "Bring her," Anna said finally, heart pounding. Later that afternoon, a battered green pickup rumbled to a stop outside the clinic. Clara climbed down with a grunt, opening the passenger door for Sandra, an 8-year-old German Shepherd with kind eyes and a coat the color of autumn wheat. Sandra hopped out gracefully, her eyes bright with curiosity. She sniffed the air, ears twitching, and then glanced back at Clara, who murmured softly, stroking the fur between her ears. "She's been a mother 3 times now," Clara said, her voice a mix of pride and nerves. "Never turned a pup away, not even the runts." Anna managed a small smile. "Let's hope that extends to big cats," she replied, leading them inside. In the clinic, Sandra's nose twitched at the scent of antiseptics and milk. Her gaze fell on the cubs, nestled together in a soft bed of blankets, eyes still closed, tiny paws kneading the air instinctively. The room went silent, every breath held. Sandra's tail gave a tentative wag. Then, without command or hesitation, she padded over to the cubs, sniffing them gently. One of the cubs stirred, letting out a pitiful mewl. Sandra responded instantly, lying down beside them, curling her body protectively around their small forms. The cubs nuzzled blindly into her fur, whimpering until they found her belly and latched on. Relief broke over the room like sunlight through clouds. Anna let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Marcus wiped a hand over his face, laughing shakily. "Unbelievable," he muttered. "Absolutely unbelievable." For hours, Sandra lay unmoving, only shifting slightly to lick each cub in turn, her tongue rasping softly over fur still damp from formula. It was a mother's touch, instinctive, tender, and fiercely protective. Anna watched in awe, her eyes misting. It wasn't just survival that the cubs had found. It was a chance to thrive, to learn warmth and safety from a mother who owed them nothing, yet gave everything. That night, when the clinic fell quiet, Anna stayed late, sitting by the pen and watching as Sandra groomed her adoptive children, eyes half closed in contentment. The cubs, bellies round with milk, pressed close to her warmth, tiny paws kneading her fur with blind trust. For the first time since the cubs had been taken from Sirona, Anna allowed herself to hope. Weeks passed, and the cubs thrived under Sandra's care. Their fur, once thin and dull, grew soft and golden, glistening with health. The male cub, bold and curious, was the first to open his eyes. Liquid amber glinting with mischief as he batted at Sandra's tail, stumbling over oversized paws. His sister, smaller and more timid, took longer, her eyes a darker shade of gold, filled with cautious wonder. Sandra, ever patient, guided them gently, her movements slow and deliberate. She herded them back with a soft nudge of her nose whenever they ventured too far from her warmth. When they mewled hungrily, she rolled to her side without hesitation, letting them nurse until their bellies were round and full. The staff, who visited frequently, watched the unfolding scene with disbelief and awe, camera lenses glinting as they captured every tender moment. Even Marcus, usually gruff and impatient, found excuses to linger in the clinic, his grins wide and unguarded. In those quiet hours when the clinic was empty, Anna would sit cross-legged by the pen, fingers brushing idly through the fur of Sandra's puppy, an excitable ball of fluff with a white-tipped ear and a penchant for tumbling into the cubs. The puppy seemed oblivious to the difference in size and claws, treating the cubs as siblings, yipping and tackling them with abandon. The cubs, surprised at first, soon took to the game with enthusiasm, batting him back with sheathed claws and tiny growls that ended in curious purrs. Sandra watched over them all with the calm authority of an experienced mother, intervening only when the play grew too rough, her bark a gentle reprimand. The sight was a balm to Anna's weary heart. As the cubs grew stronger, their personalities bloomed. The male cub, whom Marcus nicknamed Kian, was adventurous and bold, the first to test his budding strength against the edges of the pen, swatting at shadows and pouncing on imaginary prey. His sister Lila was quieter, her movements graceful and deliberate. She followed Sandra closely, often curling into her fur with a contented sigh, eyes half-lidded with peace. Sandra's patience was limitless. She groomed them diligently, her tongue smoothing their fur in rhythmic strokes that left them purring softly. Every scratch, every whimper, was met with a gentle nose and a low whine of concern, her eyes warm with unconditional love. Even when Kian bit too hard, all needle teeth and exuberance, Sandra merely huffed, licking his head until he released her tail with a sheepish mewl. The staff marveled at the bond between them, a connection that seemed to defy nature itself. The director, a wiry man with a perpetually furrowed brow, spent hours reviewing the security footage, shaking his head in disbelief. "Never seen anything like it," he muttered one evening, the glow of the monitor painting his face in hues of blue and gray. "Cross-species adoption isn't unheard of, but this is unprecedented." Anna, standing beside him, only smiled, eyes soft with quiet pride. "She's a good mother," she said simply. "The best." But beneath the wonder lurked a growing concern. The cubs were thriving, yes, but they were lions, destined to grow far beyond Sandra's ability to protect or teach them. Already Kian's claws were sharpening, his pounces more accurate, less playful. The time would soon come when instinct would outweigh affection, when their teeth, still small and milk-white, would grow long and lethal. Anna's chest tightened at the thought, her gaze shifting to Sandra, curled protectively around her adoptive children, eyes half closed in contentment. The dog had given everything to save them. Taking the cubs away felt like a betrayal. The decision came one evening in late autumn. The sun hung low and crimson over the horizon, bathing the reserve in hues of fire and rose. Anna stood at the clinic door, fingers twisting anxiously in her coat pockets as the director spoke, his voice a low murmur beneath the wind. "They're outgrowing her," he said not unkindly. "We have to move them to a larger enclosure, somewhere they can stretch their legs, somewhere safe. Sandra's done more than we could have hoped for, but we can't risk leaving them together much longer." Anna's mouth was dry, the words sticking. She looked past him, through the glass to where Sandra lay, her head resting on her paws, eyes soft and watchful as Kian and Lila wrestled nearby. She could already feel the ache of loss settling beneath her ribs. But she knew he was right. The cubs needed more than Sandra could give. The move was scheduled for morning. The staff arrived at dawn, faces tight with forced smiles as they gathered by the pen. Sandra, sensing the tension, rose with a soft whine, ears flicking uncertainly. When Anna crouched beside her, wrapping her arms around the dog's sturdy neck, Sandra nuzzled her cheek, tail wagging slowly. "You did so well," Anna whispered, voice thick. "Better than anyone could have asked." "Thank you." Sandra's ears perked at the tremor in Anna's voice, her eyes wide and worried. She nudged Anna's hand with her nose, a soft huff of concern. Anna bit her lip, fighting the sting of tears. The cubs, confused by the bustle, clung close to Sandra, tiny claws tangling in her fur, eyes wide and anxious. When the handlers lifted them, cradling them with care, their cries rose high and desperate, paws reaching back for the warmth of the mother they had come to trust. Sandra barked sharply, lunging forward, but Anna caught her, arms tight around the shepherd's chest, murmuring soothing words even as her own voice cracked. "It's okay," she said, the words half choked. "They'll be okay." But Sandra's eyes, wide and frantic, never left her children as they were carried away, tiny voices echoing down the hall. That night, Sandra lay curled on her blankets in the empty pen, head on her paws, ears twitching at every distant sound. The absence of small, warm bodies pressed against her flanks left her shivering despite the heat lamps, her eyes open and glistening with confusion and grief. Anna sat outside the pen long after the lights dimmed, forehead pressed to the cool metal bars, guilt a heavy knot in her stomach. She whispered apologies into the dark, hands trembling. But Sandra's eyes never left the door, waiting with a patience that twisted Anna's heart, waiting for a family that would not return. 2 years passed. Seasons bled into each other, and the White Lion Reserve thrived with new life and visitors. The once small cubs, Kian and Lila, were now nearly full-grown, their coats thick and gleaming beneath the sun. Kian, powerful and golden, moved with a regal stride, his shoulders broad and eyes sharp with confidence. Lila, though smaller, was no less striking, her eyes darker, movements fluid and precise. Together they commanded the larger enclosure, a pair of majestic predators who, despite their strength, displayed an unusual gentleness toward the reserve staff. While other lions prowled and snarled, Kian and Lila would rub against the fences with low, rumbling purrs, their eyes soft and warm. They greeted familiar faces with playful swipes and rolled lazily in the grass, much to the delight of visitors who snapped pictures in awe. The staff often whispered about the phenomenon, about how two apex predators could carry such domestic warmth, how they never roared at feeding time, never lunged at the gates. To Anna, it was no mystery. The answer lay in the eyes of the lions, in the way their ears perked at the sound of a soft bark on the wind. Sandra's legacy lingered in every gesture, in every nuzzle and purr. Sandra herself was aging. Her muzzle had grayed, and her eyes, though still bright, carried a weary softness. Arthritis stiffened her legs, turning her once playful bounds into slow, careful steps. Clara kept her warm and comfortable, wrapping her in soft blankets and feeding her by hand on colder days. But Sandra's eyes often drifted to the distance, to the outline of the reserve's fences against the sky. Clara, watching, would sigh and scratch behind her ears, voice gentle with the weight of understanding. "I know, old girl," she murmured, fingers buried in Sandra's fur. "You miss them, don't you?" Sandra's ears flicked, a soft whine escaping her chest, eyes half-lidded with a sadness that needed no words. On the days when Sandra's limp grew too pronounced, Clara would lift her into the truck with a grunt and a fond chuckle, her hands soothing. "Let's take you to see them," she would say, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. Sandra's ears would perk, tail thumping weakly against the seat, nose pressed eagerly to the window as they made their way to the reserve. Word of the reunion spread quickly. The director himself stood by the gates, arms crossed tightly, his face a mask of forced calm that failed to hide the tension in his shoulders. Anna waited beside him, wringing her hands, eyes fixed on the enclosure where Kian and Lila prowled. The lions, now 3 times Sandra's size, paced restlessly, ears flicking toward the sound of approaching tires, noses twitching with every change in the wind. Anna's heart pounded with fear and hope in equal measure. Clara pulled up slowly, the truck rumbling to a stop. Sandra's ears pricked at the familiar scents, her tail sweeping slowly over the seat. Clara eased open the door, voice soft and coaxing. "Come on, girl," she whispered, lifting Sandra down with care. Sandra hesitated only a moment before her nose met the ground, paws shuffling with excitement despite the stiffness in her joints. Her head lifted, nose to the air, and her tail began to wag with a slow, hesitant rhythm. The gate loomed ahead, massive and daunting, separating Sandra from the only children she had ever known. The staff gathered with bated breath as Clara unclipped Sandra's leash, hands trembling. The gate slid open with a groan of metal, and Sandra paused, eyes wide and ears pricked, before stepping forward with halting steps. Kian's head snapped up at once, golden eyes fixed, muscles tense. Lila's ears flattened, a low rumble vibrating her chest. Anna's breath caught, fingers pressed to her mouth. But then Kian's ears swiveled forward, eyes narrowing with a flicker of recognition. His growl died abruptly, replaced by a soft whine that seemed impossibly out of place in the throat of a predator. In 2 powerful bounds, he closed the distance, massive paws barely brushing the ground. The staff flinched instinctively, several hands darting to the tranquilizer guns at their belts. But Anna's voice cut through, raw and urgent. "Wait!" Kian skidded to a stop before Sandra, looming above her with eyes wide and frantic. He sniffed once, twice, and then his massive head lowered with a chuffing sound, uncertain, trembling. Sandra's ears flicked back briefly before she surged forward, pressing her nose to his chest with a soft whine. The tension shattered. Kian rumbled deep in his throat, a sound too warm to be a growl, and pressed back, head dipping to nuzzle Sandra's side with shocking gentleness. Lila followed suit, her eyes wide and dark, a hesitant step at a time, until she too was pressed close, head tucked beneath Sandra's chin. The shepherd barked once, high and soft, her tail wagging furiously, tongue flicking over golden fur with frantic, motherly urgency. The lion's massive bodies quivered with what could only be described as delight, eyes half-lidded, purring so deeply that the ground seemed to vibrate with the sound. Anna's hands shook at her sides, a sob caught in her throat. The director, silent and wide-eyed, pressed a hand to his mouth, turning away briefly. Hours passed, but Sandra did not move. Curled between the lions, her small frame dwarfed by golden fur, she groomed them ceaselessly, tongue rasping over ears and noses, as if to reassure herself that they were real, that her babies had truly returned to her. Kian rolled lazily onto his side, massive paws folding gently around her, eyes fluttering with sleepy contentment. Lila draped herself over Sandra's back, purring so loudly that Anna could feel the vibrations in her chest even from a distance. The staff watched in silence, some wiping at their eyes with trembling hands, others capturing the scene with shaking cameras. None dared move too quickly, as if afraid to shatter the fragile peace that had settled over the enclosure. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the grass, Sandra's eyes began to droop, head resting against Lila's flank. The lions lay watchful and still, paws cradling the shepherd's small body, eyes half closed and peaceful. Anna wiped at her cheeks, a watery smile breaking through. Clara's hand, warm and firm, settled over her shoulder, squeezing gently. "She did good," Clara murmured, voice thick with pride and sadness all at once. Anna could only nod, swallowing hard. Her gaze drifted to the lions, to Sandra, to the way Lila's tail thumped softly against the earth with every gentle snore the shepherd let out. In that moment, surrounded by the low purrs of lions and the soft sighs of a shepherd, Anna allowed herself to believe in miracles. Sandra's health declined faster than anyone expected. Her once energetic bounds turned to slow, careful steps, and her eyes, though still warm, dulled with exhaustion. The arthritis that had stiffened her joints worsened, turning every movement into a visible effort. Clara, ever gentle, carried her up the porch steps when her legs refused to obey, bundled her in thick blankets by the fire, and fed her soft meals by hand. Yet for all the comforts of home, Sandra's gaze often drifted to the window, ears flicking at the faintest sound beyond the trees, eyes soft with longing. Clara saw it each time and sighed, fingers brushing through Sandra's fur with a tenderness born of shared sorrow. "I know, old girl," she whispered, voice thick with understanding. "You miss them, don't you?" Sandra's ears perked, a soft whine slipping free, and Clara chuckled low, the sound wet and weary. "All right," she said with a fond shake of her head. "One last visit, then." The call was made the next morning, Anna's voice brightening despite the early hour. "Of course," she said quickly, words tumbling over each other in her eagerness. "We'd love to have her. The lions? They've been restless all week. It's like they know." Arrangements were swift. By midday, Clara's battered truck was rumbling down the reserve's path. Sandra curled in the passenger seat with her nose pressed eagerly to the window. The drive was long, but Sandra remained alert, ears pricked and eyes fixed forward, tail sweeping slowly over the seat with every familiar scent that brushed through the cracked window. Clara's hand rested on her back, fingers soothing circles through her fur, voice a quiet hum beneath the rumble of tires. "One more time, my brave girl," she murmured. "Just one more time." When they arrived, the staff was already gathered by the main gate, faces tight with barely concealed nerves. Keon and Lila, sensing the excitement, paced restlessly in their enclosure, golden eyes fixed on the gate, with ears pressed forward, tails flicking with every step. Their movements were tense, impatient, as if they could feel the approach of something familiar yet longed for, their low purrs reverberating in the still air. Anna stood closest to the gate, hands clenching and unclenching at her sides, eyes bright with a mix of hope and dread. The director's arms were crossed tightly, his frown deep, but he made no move to halt the proceedings, only sighed heavily and nodded at Clara as she approached. Clara lifted Sandra down carefully, murmuring soft reassurances as the shepherd's paws touched the ground. Sandra's ears flicked forward at once, nose twitching with a huff of breath, her body quivering with something raw and eager. The gate creaked open slowly, metal groaning and dust rising in lazy spirals. Sandra paused at the threshold, eyes wide and bright, tail wagging in slow, tentative sweeps. The lions froze mid-step, heads snapping up in unison, eyes fixed and unblinking. A heartbeat passed, then another, and then with a thunderous rumble that sent a shiver down every spine present, Keon roared, deep and resonant, a sound that rattled the fence and sent birds scattering from the trees. Leela followed with a growl of her own, lower, desperate, paws digging into the earth as if to anchor herself. The sound should have been terrifying, should have sent Sandra cowering, but instead her tail wagged faster, a soft bark escaping her throat, ears perked and eyes gleaming. And then she was moving, stiff legs forgotten, paws scraping over the ground with a determination that belied her age. The lions surged forward with a force that left the ground trembling, all teeth and claws and eyes bright with wild longing. Gasps echoed behind the fence, hands darting to tranquilizers and voices rising in alarm. But Anna's shout cut through, raw and frantic. "Wait! Just wait!" Keon reached Sandra first, massive paws skidding to a halt mere inches from her, golden eyes wide and wild, breath shuddering in great huffs that fanned her fur. Lila circled tightly, her body trembling, with barely restrained energy, eyes darting between her brother and the shepherd, a soft whine building in her chest. Sandra, undeterred, pressed forward with a soft bark, nose brushing Kian's chest, tail wagging with joyful desperation. The great lion, pride leader, apex predator, let out a sound that was nearly a sob, a deep rumble that quivered through the air and crumpled forward, head bowing to nuzzle into Sandra's fur with a keening purr. Lila followed at once, pressing close, her head ducking beneath Sandra's chin with a rumbling trill that vibrated through her chest. Sandra's tongue flicked out in rapid, frantic strokes, rasping over fur and ears and eyes with all the urgency of a mother who has spent years apart from her children. Her tail thumped wildly against the earth, nose buried in golden manes as she whined and huffed and barked, paws shifting eagerly beneath her. Hours passed, and the lions never left her side. Kian draped a massive paw over Sandra's back, eyes half-lidded with peace as her tongue rasped gently over his ears. Lila curled tightly against the shepherd's other side, eyes closed, purring so loudly that the ground seemed to hum with the sound. Sandra, content, lay her head over Kian's paws, eyes drifting closed with a soft sigh, body pressed between her children with a weariness that seemed to melt beneath the warmth of golden fur. The staff, long since disarmed and wide-eyed, watched in silence, some wiping at their eyes with shaking hands, others capturing the scene with trembling cameras. Anna's hands were pressed to her mouth, eyes wet and glistening as she stared through the fence, a smile breaking through her tears. As dusk bled to night, the lions grew still, breaths evening to soft huffs, eyes dark and lidded. Sandra's breaths too grew slow and steady, chest rising and falling in gentle waves, eyes fluttering with every rumbling purr that reverberated through the ground. Clara, standing by the fence with one hand pressed to her mouth, watched with wet eyes and a smile that quivered with each breath. "She's home," she whispered, voice cracking. Anna's breath hitched, a sob catching in her throat, and she nodded, words tangled and broken. "Yeah," she rasped, wiping at her eyes with shaking fingers. "She is." As stars blinked awake above, the enclosure fell quiet, breaths and purrs soft and even. Sandra, cradled between the lions, eyes half closed and lips quirked in a tired smile, drifted into sleep with a contented sigh. The lions, massive and vigilant, pressed closer, golden eyes glinting with shadows and light, tails sweeping slow over the earth. And there, beneath the silver glow of moonlight, mother and cubs slept entwined, golden fur tangled with gray, breaths mingling with low purrs, hearts beating slow and steady in time. The staff watched in silence, hands clutched tight, eyes glistening in the dark, and the director, stoic and weathered, breathed deep, lips curving with a sigh that trembled. For tonight, at least, the world was at peace. Sandra's health failed swiftly after that final visit. The days blurred into each other, a slow descent marked by longer naps and dwindling meals, her breath shallow and labored. Clara remained by her side, voice soft and constant, fingers brushing through Sandra's fur, even as her own hands trembled with the weight of inevitability. The fireplace crackled warmly in the background, its glow casting amber light over the quilt that swaddled Sandra's frail body. Outside, frost clung stubbornly to the window panes, and the trees, bare and brittle, bowed beneath the wind. Sandra's eyes, though dulled by age and exhaustion, remained warm, flicking upward whenever Clara spoke, ears twitching faintly at the familiar cadence of her voice. The shepherd's tail, once a blur of energy, now gave only the faintest of wags, slow and tired, but grateful all the same. Clara swallowed against the tightness in her throat, voice breaking with every whispered reassurance. "You've done so well, my sweet girl," she murmured, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "So brave. They'll never forget you. None of us will." Sandra's eyes drifted closed with a soft huff, her body sinking further into the blankets with a shuddering breath. The news spread quickly through the reserve. hushed whispers rippling from the clinic to the visitor's center, from the security stations to the keeper's quarters. Anna, who received the call herself, had to excuse herself to the staff room, the door clicking softly behind her as she sank into a chair, hands shaking. The director, stoic and grim, pinched the bridge of his nose and breathed deep, eyes falling closed. No one spoke above a murmur, and even the radios seemed to crackle more softly, voices low and somber. The lions, too, grew restless. Keon and Lila paced the edges of their enclosure, ears flicking forward at every gust of wind, golden eyes fixed on the path that led to the gates. Their roars, once deep and thunderous, fell quiet, replaced by low rumbles and huffs that vibrated through the earth. They pressed close to each other, flanks brushing, tails curling and uncurling with anxious twitches. The keepers, who had come to understand the siblings' moods, exchanged worried glances but said nothing, fingers white-knuckled on the fence rails. Sandra passed on a Sunday morning, the sun rising pale and cold over the treetops. It was peaceful, the final breath slipping from her chest with a soft sigh, eyes fluttering closed as if simply drifting to sleep. Clara wept openly, her face pressed to the quilt, shoulders trembling with the force of it, fingers knotted tightly in the gray fur that was still warm beneath her hands. The house, usually quiet and unassuming, was filled with the sounds of grief, shuddering breaths and broken whispers, and the fire crackling low and mournful. Even the wind seemed to still, pausing in its howl to bow its head to the passing of something good and gentle and brave. Clara stayed by her side long after the warmth had faded, fingers brushing softly through Sandra's fur, voice hoarse with whispered prayers and apologies and thank yous. "You rest now, love," she breathed, pressing her lips to the shepherd's forehead. "You did everything you could. You did more than anyone could have asked." By afternoon, the news had reached the reserve. Anna, who had forced herself back to the clinic, sank against the wall, face in her hands, breaths coming fast and uneven. The director's hand, warm and steady, settled on her shoulder, a quiet anchor amidst the torrent. The staff gathered slowly, some blinking through wet eyes, others wiping at their faces with sleeves and backs of hands, voices tangled in whispers of disbelief and sadness. None moved for a long while, as if the very act of stepping forward would somehow shatter the reality of it all. Even the visitors, sensing the shift in atmosphere, fell quiet, eyes drifting curiously to the staff who lingered by the gates with heavy shoulders and downcast eyes. In the enclosure, Kian and Lila knew before the gate swung open. Their ears snapped forward, heads lifting as one, golden eyes dark and wide. The unease that had coiled tightly in their chests unraveled into something raw and painful, claws digging into the earth with desperate shuddering breaths. They prowled forward with a sort of frantic determination, eyes fixed on the path, nostrils flaring with each gust of wind that bore nothing but the scent of frost and pine. Anna approached with careful steps, the weight of the urn clutched tightly to her chest, fingers white and trembling. The ashes, warm even through the metal, felt impossibly heavy, a burden that left her legs weak and eyes blurred with tears. The gate groaned open, and Kian surged forward at once, a low growl rumbling in his chest, ears flattened to his skull, eyes glistening with something that wasn't anger, but something deeper, something broken and hollow. Lila followed with a whine, head low, tail lashing behind her. Anna's hands shook as she knelt, the urn clutched tight between her palms. Kian's breath washed hot over her hands, eyes wide and frantic, nose pressing desperately against the metal, paws shifting and scraping against the earth with soft huffs. Lila circled tightly, her purrs gone, replaced by soft whines that quivered with each exhale. Anna's voice broke when she spoke, words splintering with every syllable. "I'm sorry," she whispered, head bowing. I'm so sorry. She loved you. She loved you so much." The urn lid unscrewed slowly, metal scraping and clicking, and Anna's breath hitched, shoulders curling inward as she scattered the ashes over the earth, over the grass and roots and dirt that glinted beneath the sun. Kian's nose dipped at once, paws shuffling forward, ears pressed flat, eyes half-lidded and wide with grief. He chuffed low and pained, a sound that quivered through the ground, and lowered himself to the ashes, massive head bowing until his nose pressed to the soil. Lila whimpered softly, her body folding down beside her brother, eyes wide and shining with disbelief. They lay there for hours, noses pressed to the ground, tails still and breaths slow and shuddering. Weeks passed, but the enclosure remained quiet. Kian and Lila pressed close, paws cradling the patch of earth where the ashes had settled. The staff, uncertain and grieving in their own right, left flowers by the fence, sunflowers and daisies and wild poppies, their petals bright and vibrant against the frost. A statue was commissioned, funded by donations that poured in from visitors and locals alike, bronze and gleaming, capturing Sandra mid-step with her head lifted, ears perked, eyes warm and bright with love. It was placed beside the fence where Kian and Lila lingered, where the sun cast it in gold and the flowers grew thick and wild. The plaque at its base read simply, Sandra, Mother of Lions. Anna visited every morning, fingers brushing over the cool metal, voice a soft murmur of stories and thanks and apologies. The lions who watched from the shade rumbled deep and slow, eyes dark but gentle. And so, Sandra's legacy lived on, in the purrs of the lions who pressed to the fence, in the flowers that bloomed bright and warm, in the whispers of visitors who marveled at the statue and the story behind it. The reserve, usually bustling and busy, fell quiet each dawn, breaths held as the sun rose gold and glowing over the trees, casting Sandra's statue in light that gleamed like fire. In the silence that followed, as petals swayed and lions purred low and deep, it was almost as if Sandra was still there, watching with eyes soft and bright and proud, guarding her children even now.